At about 9 in the morning on September 12, 1897, 21 soldiers of the 36th Sikhs stood on the roof of a small mud and stone building, 6,000 feet above sea level in what is today the northwest corner of Pakistan. Across the bare ridges around them, armed men were beginning to appear. First, there were a few figures on the slopes, then a few hundred, then thousands. Their outpost was called Saragarhi. It was not really a fort, it was a signal relay, a rectangular blockhouse about the size of a suburban house, with a mirror mounted on a tripod at one corner. The two real British forts on this stretch of the Samana Range could not see each other across the rocky spine between them. Saragarhi could see both. Its job was to catch flashes of Morse code from one fort and bounce them in sunlight to the other. 21 riflemen and a heliograph. That was the whole garrison. British officers watching from miles away would later estimate the tribal force at between 10,000 and 14,000 men, Afridi and Orakzai warriors from the surrounding Pashtun clans, moving in disciplined masses and cutting every path back to help. The 19-year-old signaller on the roof of Saragarhi tilted his mirror toward the nearest British fort and flashed the situation to his commanding officer. The reply came back within minutes. No help was coming. From that moment, the 21 men in the mud hut were alone. For the next 7 hours, they held. They did not break out. They did not surrender when ammunition ran short. They did not abandon the post when the outer wall was breached. Every one of them died at his station. So did an unarmed Muslim sweeper attached to the garrison, who picked up a rifle from a fallen soldier and fought beside them. The question is not simply how they died, it is why they stayed. Human beings mostly do not behave this way. When the math turns impossible, when it is plain to every soldier that survival is no longer on the table, most detachments break. Most so-called last stands in the historical record are actually collapses in slow motion, held together by hope until the hope gives out. When hope goes, the line runs. Saragarhi did not run. 21 men, cut off, unrelieved, and outnumbered roughly 500 to 1, held a mud hut for 7 hours against every rational calculation of survival. Why? To answer that, we have to step back to a line drawn on a map 4 years earlier, to a religious community forged through centuries of persecution, and to a peculiar imperial arrangement that placed 21 Punjabi soldiers on a mud roof in a war none of them had started, then told them to hold it. By the last decade of the 19th century, the British Empire had run out of comfortable frontiers. In the east, its Indian territories brushed up against Burma. In the north, they climbed into the Himalayas. And in the northwest, the direction that mattered most in London's strategic imagination, they collided with the tangled highlands beyond the Indus, the traditional invasion route from Central Asia. This was the ground of the so-called Great Game, the long contest between the British and Russian empires over who would dominate the space between them. British anxiety about a Russian move toward India was almost paranoid. Every mountain pass mattered. Every ridge had to be watched. The trouble was that nobody actually controlled these mountains. The Pashtun tribes who lived there, Afridi, Orakzai, Wazir, Momand, and a dozen others, were not truly subjects of the British Raj. Nor were they truly subjects of the Afghan king across the border. They were fiercely independent, organized around clan and honor, and armed to a degree that made every British officer nervous. British India did not so much rule this frontier as garrison it. Small forts stood along the ridges. Roads ran only where troops could force them through. A permanent low-grade war never quite ended and never quite escalated. Until it did. In 1893, the British thought they could fix the problem with a line on a map. A senior civil servant named Sir Mortimer Durand negotiated an agreement with the Afghan emir, drawing a border between British and Afghan spheres of influence straight through the tribal territories. It was a diplomatic solution, clean cartographic, and satisfying in a London office. On the ground, it was a disaster. The line ignored clan territories entirely. It cut villages' pastures and family networks in half. It gave the tribes no say, and it was interpreted accurately as British expansion by another name. The border survives today as the Durand Line, and Pashtun resentment over how it was drawn survives with it. Without that line and the grievance it created, the events of 1897 would have been almost impossible to imagine. For a few years, the resentment stayed local. Then, in the summer of 1897, it detonated. The trigger was religious as much as political. Across the frontier that year, Muslim preachers, the most famous of them, a wandering figure called the Fakir of Swat, began traveling from valley to valley, calling for jihad against the British presence. The message landed on ground already prepared by the Durand Line. Then something happened that had almost never happened before on that frontier. The tribes united. Clans that had spent generations feuding with one another found themselves fighting side by side. Between June and August, a wave of coordinated attacks swept across the entire northwest frontier. British garrisons that had assumed the surrounding hills could be contained suddenly found themselves under siege by a fighting force no one had planned for. At the center of the storm was a stretch of high, broken country called the Samana Range, a jagged, arid ridge running east to west through what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in Pakistan. The British held it with 3 positions. 2 were real forts, Fort Lockhart at the eastern end and Fort Gulistan at the western end. Both were built of stone, garrisoned by hundreds of men and stocked to hold out for weeks. The problem was geography. Between the 2 forts ran a rocky spine that blocked their line of sight. In an era before radio, that mattered enormously. If one fort came under attack, the other might not know for hours. The British solution was Saragarhi. Halfway between the 2 forts, on a small hill that could see both, they built the signal post, a mud and stone blockhouse 40 feet by 50, with a heliograph tower at one corner. The heliograph was clever 19th century technology, a tripod-mounted mirror that reflected sunlight in flashes of Morse code readable through a telescope from miles away. On a clear day at that altitude, the flashes could be seen across the entire range. Saragarhi was the invisible line connecting the 2 visible forts. Cut Saragarhi and the Samana Range would go dark. It was garrisoned by 21 men. That number matters. So does who they were. The 36th Sikhs was a young regiment, raised only 10 years earlier in 1887, and drawn entirely from Sikh recruits across Punjab. To understand why the British had a Sikh regiment defending a signal post against Pashtun tribesmen, and what the 21 men on that roof believed a soldier owed his post, you have to understand something about the community they came from. The Sikh faith had emerged in Punjab during the 15th century as a distinct religious tradition. By the 18th century, it had also developed a distinct martial tradition. Under the last of its 10 gurus, Guru Gobind Singh, the community had been reorganized into the Khalsa, a body of initiated Sikhs bound by a specific code. That code included carrying a sword, wearing uncut hair beneath a turban, and, crucially, defending the weak while refusing submission to tyranny, even at the cost of one's life. This was not abstract theology. Sikh identity had been forged through centuries of persecution under the later Mughal emperors. It developed a tradition in which martial resistance was, in effect, a spiritual duty. The concept had a name: the Haram Yudh, the righteous war. It treated the refusal to yield as a form of worship. That obligation is the invisible weight behind every account of what came next. When the British finally defeated and annexed the Sikh kingdom of Punjab in 1849, they inherited an entire military culture. Rather than dismantle it, they recruited from it. By the end of the 19th century, Sikh regiments were among the most trusted units in the entire Indian Army. The 36th Sikhs was one of them. Its officers were British, its soldiers were Punjabi Sikhs, and its detachment at Saragarhi, on the morning the ridges filled, consisted of 21 men led by a Havildar, a rank roughly equivalent to sergeant named Ishar Singh. Ishar Singh is worth pausing on, because he was the man who made the decisions that morning. By all accounts, he was not the model regimental soldier the British would have designed if they could. He had a reputation as a difficult subordinate, proud, stubborn, and capable of clashing with his officers. The historian and former Chief Minister of Punjab, Captain Havildar Singh, has argued that this was precisely the kind of man Saragarhi needed on September 12th. A more compliant, more institutional soldier might have looked at the odds and quietly begun negotiating a way out. Ishar Singh refused to yield out of something closer to personal honor than institutional discipline, martial pride, ego, and fierce loyalty to his own men. The distinction matters. What held the line at Saragarhi may not have been blind obedience. It was something older and more personal than that. Beside Ishar Singh stood 20 men whose names are still read aloud at parade grounds across India more than a century later. Most were in their 20s or early 30s. The signaller at the mirror, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, was 19, the youngest man at the post. His primary job was not to fight. It was to keep the flashes moving between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, no matter what happened around him. Also inside the walls that morning, though not counted among the 21, was a Muslim non-combatant attached to the garrison as a sweeper. A man remembered by history only by a single name, Daad. His formal duties did not involve combat. At the beginning of that day, his only tool was a broom. Through the previous week, the situation on the Samana Range had been growing steadily darker. Between September 3rd and September 9th, tribal forces had launched probing attacks against Fort Gulistan, testing the walls and testing the British will to hold. The attacks had been repelled, but they confirmed what the British already suspected. A very large force was gathering somewhere in the hills. Both of the large stone forts pulled in, tightened their perimeters, and waited for reinforcements from the lowlands. The small signal post between them did not have that option. Its walls were mud. Its garrison was 21. And when the mist lifted from the ridges on the morning of September 12th, and the sunlight caught the first tribal banners moving across the slopes, the men on the roof of Saragarhi understood with perfect clarity that they had been left entirely on their own. Havildar Ishar Singh stepped onto the parapet and looked out. Then he turned to the signaller at the mirror. Enemy approaching in strength. Request reinforcement. At about 9:30 that morning, the young signaller on the roof of Saragarhi tilted the mirror toward Fort Lockhart and flashed the message, letter by letter, across 4 miles of open air. Sunlight bounced from the glass, was caught through a telescope on a stone tower to the east, and translated into words on a page. The officer reading those words was Lieutenant Colonel John Houghton, the commanding officer at Fort Lockhart. He had served with the 36th Sikhs since the regiment's founding. For the rest of that day, he would occupy an unusual position in military history. He was the commander of the doomed garrison. He knew every man in it by name, and he would watch them die one by one through a telescope from 4 miles away. Unable to intervene, Houghton walked onto his own parapet and raised the telescope. From Fort Lockhart, he could see Saragarhi clearly, a small, pale rectangle on its distant hill. Around it, thousands of figures were moving across every slope. He could also see movement on the hills closer to his own fort. Fort Lockhart itself was under threat. Any relief column sent toward Saragarhi would be cut to pieces before it reached halfway. Houghton signaled back. The reply that reached the mirror at Saragarhi amounted to 3 words. No help coming. That was the moment the decision had to be made, and it had to be made by the 21 men on the roof. There were, in theory, alternatives. Ishar Singh could have ordered an immediate breakout while the tribal cordon was still forming, a suicidal downhill charge toward Fort Lockhart, but one that offered at least some chance that a handful of men might survive. He could have opened negotiations. Or he could have done what garrison commanders throughout history have often done when the numbers turned impossible. Make a plausible show of resistance for an hour or two, then quietly surrender. He did none of those things. According to the surviving accounts reconstructed from British telescope observations, the positions of bodies later found in the ruins, and the deliberate manner in which the signaling continued, Ishar Singh gathered his 20 men in the courtyard. He told them what Houghton's message said. Then he asked what they intended to do. There was no dissent. Later Sikh regimental accounts say the men chose to hold. Fix bayonets. Defend the post. Do their duty until doing it was no longer possible. Ishar Singh gave the order to stand to. Gurmukh Singh tilted the mirror toward Fort Lockhart once again. For the next 6.5 hours, he would send a calm, continuous narration of everything happening around him. Every assault, every death, every collapse of the defenses, to a commanding officer 4 miles away, who could do nothing but write it down. The first serious assault came at around 10 o'clock. The tribesmen advanced up the slope in coordinated waves. They were not a mob. They moved in organized formations under Pashtun commanders whose names did not survive in the British record. Here, one of the most durable myths about Saragarhi has to be corrected. Popular retellings, particularly modern film dramatizations, often depict the Afridi and Orakzai as an undisciplined swarm, tribal warriors hurling themselves mindlessly at the walls until sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenders. That is not what the historical record shows. The Pashtun tribes of the northwest frontier were among the finest light infantry forces in the world at the time. Many had handled rifles from childhood. They were expert marksmen and masters of terrain ambush and flanking. They knew how to use every fold of the ground as cover. They were also fighting for a cause they believed was entirely justified: the defense of their ancestral lands against a British policy that had drawn the Durand Line through their villages without asking them. They were not villains. They were serious soldiers, and from their perspective, Saragarhi was a legitimate military target, a signal post that had to be destroyed to sever communication between the two main British forts. The assault that came up the slope at 10 o'clock was disciplined. The men receiving it knew immediately that they were in trouble. The first defender to fall was Sepoy Bhagwan Singh, hit early in the opening exchange of fire. His comrades refused to leave his body exposed on the slope. Under fire, they dragged him back inside the walls. A small act of grace on a day that would soon run short of grace. Naik Lal Singh, the second in command, was hit soon afterward. His wounds were so severe that he could no longer stand. He was carried inside and laid on a bed in the inner guardroom. From there, he continued firing his rifle for as long as he had ammunition. He would not survive the afternoon. There is another point where popular imagination and the historical record part company. The dominant modern image of the Saragarhi defenders, reinforced by the 2019 film Kesari, and generations of romanticized illustrations, shows warriors in oversized turbans wielding chakrams, curved swords, and other traditional Sikh weapons in elaborate hand-to-hand combat. That is not what the battle looked like. The 36th Sikhs was a modern, professional infantry regiment of the late Victorian British Indian Army. Its soldiers wore standard-issue khaki uniforms and regulation military turbans. They fought with Martini Henry breech-loading rifles, single-shot, black powder weapons that had served in the British military for decades. Each rifle carried a 17-inch triangular bayonet designed for close combat. Their tactics were those of Victorian infantry, aimed fire from protected positions, careful conservation of ammunition, and fixed bayonets when the enemy came close. What made the men on that hill formidable was not exotic weaponry. It was disciplined marksmanship and a deep unwillingness to give up the wall in front of them. For the first 4 hours, that was enough. Surviving estimates suggest that each defender fired somewhere around 600 rounds over the course of the battle. 600 rounds per man fired from single-shot rifles as the range repeatedly closed and opened, points to steady hands and clear heads. Tribal casualties mounted. Later British accounts, reconstructed from bodies found around the ruins, claimed that more than 600 tribesmen were killed at Saragarhi. Pashtun oral traditions give a considerably lower figure, closer to 180. Historians still dispute the exact number. What is not disputed is that the 21 defenders inflicted enough casualties over enough hours to force the tribal commanders to change their tactics. Above the courtyard on the exposed roof, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh continued working the mirror. The messages he sent that afternoon, preserved in Houghton's heliograph log, are striking not because they are eloquent, but because they are so plain. Enemy in force, 2 men killed, wall breached, requesting instructions. The mirror flashed. Bullets struck and shattered the masonry around him. He kept working. Historian squadron leader Rana T.S. China has emphasized what those 600 rounds per man were accomplishing beyond the walls of Saragarhi. The signal post was acting as a human speed bump. The tribal army moving along the Samana Range had a larger objective, Fort Gulistan. the westernmost of the two major British forts. It was undermanned and running low on supplies. If Gulistan fell that day, the British position across the entire range could collapse. But to reach it, the tribal columns first had to pass Saragarhi. Every hour spent taking the signal post was an hour not spent attacking Gulistan. 21 men on a mud roof were buying time by dying slowly for a fort miles away. By about 2 in the afternoon, the situation inside Saragarhi was becoming impossible. Ammunition was running low. Several defenders were dead. Others were badly wounded. Then the tribal commanders discovered something that changed the shape of the battle. There was a dead angle in the defenses, a strip of ground close to the outer wall where the Sikh rifles could not be lowered far enough to fire on anyone working directly beneath them. A small group of tribesmen moved into that blind spot and began working at the base of the wall. What they did was old, simple, and effective. They gathered dry brushwood, thorn scrub, and dead grass from the surrounding slopes, piled it against the wooden outer gate, and set it alight. Within minutes, thick smoke rolled over the walls. Visibility inside the courtyard collapsed. The riflemen could no longer see the attackers below. The heliograph continued flashing through a haze that sometimes hid the mirror completely. The gate itself, made of dry timber under fierce heat, began to burn through. At around 3 o'clock, it collapsed inward. What happened next is harder to reconstruct because the men who could have described it did not survive. The account rests on Haughton's observations through the telescope, the positions of bodies found 2 days later, and the oral history of the 36th Sikhs. Together, those sources describe a rearguard action rare, even among last stands. Hundreds of tribesmen poured through the broken gate into the tiny courtyard. Havildar Ishar Singh made the final tactical decision of his life. He ordered the surviving defenders to withdraw into the inner blockhouse, a smaller, more defensible room inside the outer walls, and barricade the door. He did not go with them. Ishar Singh remained alone in the courtyard with his rifle and its 17-inch bayonet. He fought to delay the men coming through the gate. He could not have expected to survive. He was not trying to. He was buying the defenders behind him 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. Whatever time they needed to drag the door into place and brace it. Ishar Singh was killed in the courtyard, in the fight he had chosen. Behind him, the door of the inner blockhouse closed. Inside were the remaining defenders. Only a handful of men, some already wounded, together with the young signaller who had come down from the roof to help hold the door. Regimental oral history says they shouted the traditional Sikh war cry, Bole So Nihal, Sat Sri Akal. It translates roughly as, whoever speaks shall be fulfilled. Truth is the timeless one. Whether every man shouted those exact words in his final moments is beyond what the historical record can prove. What the record does support is that they did not stop fighting. The tribesmen attacked the door with axes and rifle butts. When that took too long, they returned to the method that had destroyed the outer gate. Brushwood was piled against the entrance. Flames climbed the walls. Smoke filled the small room. Inside, the wounded, Naik Lal Singh remained on his bed, firing toward the doorway until he could fire no more. By about 3:30 in the afternoon, only one of the 21 men who had watched the ridges fill that morning was still alive. He was on the roof, beside the mirror, and he was 19 years old. For nearly 7 hours, Gurmukh Singh had stood on the exposed roof of Saragarhi, working the heliograph while everything around him disintegrated. He had watched the first assault break against the walls. He had watched the outer gate burn. He had watched the courtyard fill with tribesmen. He had watched his commanding officer walk out alone to buy the survivors time. Through all of it, he kept flashing messages steady, disciplined, and correct in form to the officer 4 miles away at Fort Lockhart. The last message he sent is preserved in Haughton's log, in almost bureaucratic language. Translated from the shorthand, it reads, "Enemy approaching the main gate. Request permission to dismount and join the fight." He was asking for permission to stop signaling. For a soldier trapped on a burning roof, surrounded by thousands of hostile fighters, and only minutes from death, the message was astonishingly ordinary. It was a request for standard procedural authorization. That single line is probably the most quoted document from the entire battle, and for good reason. It captures what held Saragarhi together on September 12, 1897, more clearly than any monument or film. Not fury, not fanaticism, structure. The insistence, even in the final minutes, on doing the job the right way. Houghton saw the message arrive through his telescope at Fort Lockhart. He signaled back. Permission granted. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Gurmukh Singh carefully disassembled the heliograph, packed the mirror into its leather case, fixed the bayonet onto his rifle, and climbed down from the roof. What happened during the next few minutes is where history gives way to legend, and the honest thing is to acknowledge the divide. Regimental tradition, reconstructed from later accounts and the positions of bodies found in the ruin, holds that the 19-year-old signaler fought his way into the guard room, defended it alone, and killed around 20 tribesmen before he was overwhelmed. The specific number is legend rather than verified fact. Nobody who could have counted survived, and the tribal commanders left no matching record. What is not in doubt is that the fighting around the guard room was fierce. Unable to force their way inside quickly, the attackers returned to the method that had already worked twice that day. They piled brushwood against the structure and set it on fire. At around 4 in the afternoon, the last building at Saragarhi collapsed inward in flames. Inside was the final defender of the post. Somewhere in the burning wreckage was a leather case containing the heliograph mirror that had flashed sunlight across the Samana Range since 9:30 that morning. Then the fighting stopped. For the first time in nearly 7 hours, the ridges of the Samana Range fell quiet. The tribal army moved on. Its next objective was Fort Gulistan, a few miles to the west. And here, the strategic meaning of Saragarhi becomes clear. The 7 hours bought by the 21 defenders were not 7 hours of vanity. They were 7 hours in which Fort Gulistan could do what Saragarhi could not dig in, tighten its defensive lines, and prepare. When the tribal columns finally reached Gulistan that evening, the momentum of their day was gone. They had spent men, they had spent time, they had spent daylight. The assault on Gulistan was fierce, but indecisive. The following morning, a British relief column pushed through from the lowlands and stabilized the position. Fort Gulistan did not fall. The Samana Range did not go dark. The British hold on the northwest frontier, badly shaken, survived. Historian squadron leader Rana T.S. China's argument that Saragarhi was in cold strategic terms a human speed bump that saved a much larger fort is not merely a modern interpretation. It was also the conclusion reached by British commanders on the ground. 2 days later, after the tribal cordon broke apart, a British relief column reached the ruins of Saragarhi. What they found was not precisely a battlefield. It was a small mud enclosure, still smoking, with the bodies of 21 Sikh soldiers scattered across it in the positions where they had fought. Some lay along the outer walls, some were in the courtyard. One was inside the burned-out inner room, where he had continued firing from his bed. Another badly burned lay in the wreckage of the guard room. Around them, on the slopes below, lay the tribal dead. The exact number remains disputed. British accounts recorded more than 600 bodies. Pashtun oral traditions give a figure closer to 180. Whatever the true count, it had not been achieved by luck. The defenders' bodies were recovered. The news traveled ahead of them. When the story reached London, the British Parliament did something it had almost never done for a colonial military engagement. After receiving Houghton's dispatches, the heliograph log, and the reconstruction of the final hours, the House of Commons rose together and gave a standing ovation to the 21 soldiers of the 36th Sikhs. There was nothing typical about that gesture. In the ordinary workings of the late Victorian Empire, colonial troops received medals and mentions in dispatches. They did not usually receive standing ovations from the Parliament of an imperial capital most of them had never seen. Queen Victoria awarded every one of the 21 defenders the Indian Order of Merit, the highest gallantry award then available to native troops in the British Indian Army, since the Victoria Cross was, at that time, formally reserved for European officers. The decoration was awarded posthumously to the entire detachment. It remains the only time in the history of the award that every member of a single unit received it for the same action. There is one more name that must be added to the story, though it does not appear on the memorial. The official number of Saragarhi's dead is 21. That is the number carved into the monuments raised to the defense. 21 names appear at the Gurdwaras in Amritsar and Firozepur. 21 names are read aloud every year on Saragarhi Day, but 22 men died at the post. The 22nd was Daad, the Muslim sweeper. In the British Indian Army, a sweeper was a non-combatant of the lowest formal status, a civilian servant unarmed by regulation, whose duties did not include fighting. When the assault began, Daad had every excuse to hide, surrender, or walk down the hill and disappear among the attackers, most of whom were formerly his co-religionists. Instead, he picked up a rifle from a fallen Sikh soldier and fought beside the men whose floors he had swept. He died at the post. His body was found among the ruins. Almost nothing else about him survives. His age, his village, his family, and his life, before the morning of September 12th, have disappeared from the historical record. History left him a single name, an unrecorded biography, and one decision. With a borrowed rifle in a burning courtyard, he chose to stand among the defenders of a post he had never been asked to defend. Popular retellings often leave him out. They should not. That, then, is what happened. But it does not fully answer the question with which the story began. Why did 21 soldiers and 1 civilian choose to die on a mud roof rather than take any of the exits that remained, at least in theory, available to them? There is no single answer. Any account that claims otherwise is smoothing over something the historical record refuses to simplify. But 3 threads run through every serious account of that day. The first is regimental. In 1897, the 36th Sikhs was a young unit trying to earn a name. Its soldiers had entered a tradition of Sikh military regiments that had developed an intense culture of professional pride over the previous half-century. The men at Saragarhi were not fighting for the British Empire in any abstract or romantic sense. They were fighting for the regiment beside them, the man on the next wall, the officer in the next fort, and the name of their unit. That is a small circle, but it is a very difficult one to break. The second thread is personal. As Captain Amarinder Singh has argued, Havildar Ishar Singh may not have been the ideal subordinate, but he may have been the ideal commander for that particular hour. A more compliant soldier might have opened negotiations. A more institutional one might have searched for a regulation that allowed withdrawal. Ishar Singh was too proud and too stubborn to do either. At Saragarhi on September 12th, pride and stubbornness became indistinguishable from discipline. His men followed him. His example set the tone for the entire detachment. Remove Ishar Singh from the story, and it is not clear that the story ends in the same way. The third thread is older than the regiment and older than the empire. Historian Gurinder Singh Mann has argued that it cannot be left out. It is the concept of Dharam Yudh, the righteous war, and the Khalsa Code inherited from Guru Gobind Singh 2 centuries earlier. Within that tradition, refusing to yield to overwhelming force, even at the cost of one's life, was not simply a tactical decision. It was a spiritual obligation. What appears from the outside to be suicidal discipline can appear from within the Sikh martial tradition as something closer to an act of witness. That, Mann has argued, is what allowed 21 men on a mud roof to continue fighting when every rational calculation told them to stop. Regiment, commander, faith. 3 threads twisted together on one hill on one day. Today, September 12th is observed each year by the Sikh Regiment of the Indian Army as Saragarhi Day. The names of the 21 are read aloud at Amritsar and at regimental headquarters. Across the global Sikh diaspora in Punjab, London, Vancouver, and the small farming towns of Central California, where Sikh communities have existed for more than a century, the story is passed down, retold, debated, and corrected. It has been made into films and songs. The best-known modern version is the 2019 Bollywood film, Kesari, which took considerable liberties with the historical record, but introduced Saragarhi to a global audience that had never heard of it. Within the Indian Armed Forces, the battle remains one of the defining stories of what a professional infantry unit can do when the numbers become impossible. And in the archives of the British Army, among Lieutenant Colonel Houghton's dispatches, there remains a heliograph log. It records flashes of sunlight sent across 4 miles of open air on the morning and afternoon of September 12, 1897, by a 19-year-old signaller standing on a mud roof. The messages end with a request for permission to stop signaling. Gurmukh Singh asked to join the fight. He received his answer. Then he packed the mirror carefully into its leather case, because that was the procedure. And because at Saragarhi on September 12, 1897, the procedure was the point. He fixed his bayonet. Then he went down. That is what 21 soldiers and 1 civilian chose. Not because they believed they would win. Not because they believed they would survive. They chose it because when the ridges filled that morning, when their message went out and the answer came back, there was nothing left to do but hold. And holding was the thing they had spent their lives preparing to do. The mirror is gone. The mud walls are gone. The empire is gone. The story stays.